To hear the full episode, become a patron at patreon.com/deathpanelpod.
Welcome to the Death Panel. Patrons, thank you so much for supporting the show. None of the work that we do would be possible without you. To become a Patreon supporter of the Death Panel and get access to the second weekly bonus episode, as well as the entire back catalog of bonus episodes, become a patron at patreon.com/deathpanelpod. And to help us out some more, share the show with your friends, post about your favorite episodes, pick up copies of Health Communism, Abolish Rent, and Counting Like a State at your local bookstore, or request them at your local library, and follow us at deathpanel_. I'm Beatrice Adler-Bolton, and my guest today is John Washington. John is an author, translator, and journalist who covers, among other things, climate crisis and border regimes. John is a staff writer at Lookout, an independent LGBTQ publication based in Arizona. He's the author of the books The Case for Open Borders, published by Haymarket in 2024, and The Dispossessed, A Story of Asylum and the U.S.-Mexican Border and Beyond, published by Verso in 2020. And I've asked John on the show today to talk about his new third book, which just came out in early July from Haymarket, called How to Close a Camp, Dispatches from the Fight Against Immigrant Detention. John, welcome to the Death Panel. Thank you so much for coming on the show.
Good morning, and yeah, thanks so much for having me.
It's really great to have you on, and I've been really looking forward to this conversation. How to Close a Camp, I think, is a very important book. It's a great way into thinking about the current escalation of immigration policing and incarceration as something that's core to our political economy, not an aberration, not a policy failure, not a sort of isolated issue. And you argue in the book that, well, it's common to hear people, especially in the context of mainstream reporting, but also just all over the place. It's really common to hear people talk about immigration internment camps as an unfortunate excess of a border regime that is already assumed to be so necessary as to be basically like an immovable object, right? But you challenge folks to really think about how camps, border policing, immigration policing, that this is what the border is, that this is how the border is made real. It's not some sort of side effect of a border politics gone astray, right? It's a means of sorting people. It's a means of designating who is allowed to belong, those who can be disappeared, confined, deported, abandoned, etc. And this book is about the political work of organized exclusion and the centrality of borders and this kind of bordering process to the very core of what a state is. And I think it's an especially urgent moment to be thinking through this. We're living through a time that is defined by rapidly expanding immigration policing and detention apparatuses. And though this is not by any means the first time that has happened, which we'll get into, it's certainly, I think, a significant defining moment of the second Trump presidency. And I think one thing that I really appreciated so much about the book is how it forces people to think far beyond the kind of cycle that you get sucked into of, reacting to the latest outrage, which I think takes people from the point of being like, well, oh my God, what have they done now? And walking them toward and through actually a much more difficult question, which is like how to resist the actual countless ordinary political and administrative decisions that together make a camp possible, that make this kind of violence possible. And your book really speaks to something that we return to on Death Panel again and again and again, which is that, institutions really reveal themselves less by what they claim to do than by what they actually produce. And the purpose of the border, of course, is not safety. It's not to even just regulate movement. It's to produce precarity, it's labor discipline, the production of deportability, exploitation, disposability, and also crucially economic opportunity and financial lifelines, a kind of financial baseline for the prison immigration industries. So it's all to say, I really appreciated this book, How to Close a Camp. It's an important tracing of the lineage of this system, but it's also a very practical look at how we can actually chip away at the infrastructure of the camp. It's kind of like one part history of the camp, one part theory of the border, and one part organizing manual in a way. So I want to start us by giving listeners who haven't read it yet a way into the book as a whole. So can you walk folks through the central arguments that you're making in How to Close a Camp and talk about how you want readers to understand what the camp actually is, what a camp is, why you use the word camp, and what you hope that someone can come away from the book seeing differently about borders, about incarceration, or maybe more importantly, about the possibility of dismantling both.
Yes, and thank you for that really articulate distillation, not so much of the book, but of just this moment. I mean, you really captured it, and that is something that I also attempt to do in the book. So Yeah, very glad to be in conversation with you. In very short, this book is about closing immigration detention camps. And I walk people through both the history and the current conditions of what those camps are like. And to lay it out, and I can give lots of examples here, they are torturous hellholes where
Mm-hmm.
people, our neighbors, family members suffer profoundly. In these camps, people are caged, and that is a literal representation of what happens in a lot of them. Like actual people are put into cages. They are not infrequently tortured. They are subjected to prolonged solitary confinement. They're humiliated, threatened, sometimes beaten, and increasingly killed. And, just in the first 500 or so days of the second Trump administration, there have been at least 52 deaths in ICE custody. And there potentially have been more than that. And there will be more in the next days, weeks, months. That doesn't include the number of people that have been murdered by ICE outside of detention camps. And these are really awful places where more people than ever in our history are currently confined and suffering. And so, that situation, that immediate urgent crisis is one of the primary reasons and the impetus why I wrote the book. But there are more. And one of the key arguments I make is that the camp is a linchpin of the immigration enforcement regime. The camp is a linchpin of border imperialism. Without the camp, neither of those two things can exist. And there are a lot of other major problems with how immigration enforcement is engaged by our federal government, by state and local law enforcement. But again, the camp is one of the essential pieces. And to illustrate that point, we can look at what happened late last year and early this year in Minneapolis and St. Paul. So there was this huge and unprecedented rollout of violent immigration enforcement, both Border Patrol and ICE, in this truly like ostentatious, almost theatrical way, came to the city. They named the operation Metro Surge as one of a handful of named operations, like military enforcement operations that were happening at the time. And the community stood up against them. And they suffered a lot. There was 4,000 some arrests. There was at least 2 people murdered. There was a lot of people put in detention. There was a fallout of, and we could get into some of this, the prosecution of 15 community defenders, which is ongoing and truly alarming. And the community in some way really won, both by pushing back against that rollout and by, making the heads of Kristi Noem and Greg Bovino roll. They both got sacked or replaced or, transferred by a somewhat scaling down of that specific operation. And also they won by just creating this or actually making more robust this long-standing practice of mutual aid, of community support, which has been happening in that area for a long time. Mm-hmm. So I count those two things certainly as wins. However, it didn't stop. Mm-mm. And in fact, during Metro Surge, there were at least 4 other major metropolitan areas, Atlanta, San Antonio, Miami, where there were actually more arrests over that same time period than in the Twin Cities. And what this tells us is that that sort of, again, like theatrical rollout of violence isn't necessary. What is necessary, however, is a place to put people. And you could scale back, and they have made less ostentatious these rollouts and enforcement operations, but they're still happening. They have made them more efficient, more bureaucratic, and they are still arresting people. They are still putting people in detention. They are still deporting people. They're still marginalizing people. They're still torturing people. And so those wins, again, inspiring to see, but they were not enough. And I think one of the key essential pieces of the enforcement regime is also one of the most vulnerable pieces, and that is the camp. Mm-hmm. And there are ways to push back that have proven effective. And we're seeing that in real time right now. And they had this new policy that was announced last fall, the Detention Reengineering Initiative, where they had this new idea that they would basically turn immigration detention into an Amazon-like model. And that was actually a quote by former acting head of ICE, that they would use this model of having warehouse-like hubs throughout the country. And so what they did is they started buying at exorbitant rates these warehouses with the intent to retrofit them to be warehouses for human beings. And a lot of localities were alarmed, and even places where it was, heavily MAGA supportive, deep red Trump country didn't want these places in their backyards. And they pushed back, and the administration had to cave. They were forced to cave. So there is a way to really stop these things from being built in the first place. And there is a way, and it's more complicated, from shutting them down, that are ones that are already existing. Mm-hmm. And yet we're also seeing a pivot on behalf of the federal administration right now. They realizing that the warehouse approach wasn't working and maybe isn't going to work. 18 of the warehouses were canceled. Their sales were canceled. And now they're pivoting to what they call like a turnkey approach, mm-hmm. where they're buying already existing facilities from private operators, from for-profit private prison companies, to be owned by the federal government, but yet still run by the private for-profit companies. And this is an attempt to shield them legally from lawsuits, from local pressure. But, you could say, well, okay, so I guess maybe they're going to find a way out of it. But what we have to do is shift tactics. But we also see in this case that our previous tactics were working to some degree. Again, not enough, but they are responsive in some way. And I think, well, maybe the more important takeaway is not that they're responsive, which they are, in fact, a little bit, more that the power of resistance actually works. Mm-hmm. And so, what I do in the book is both lay out what those steps have been, and there are models that need to adjust to the local conditions depending on where these camps are. But there has been this playbook that has been developed over the last few decades that does work, and we can walk through the intricacies of what that looks like. But one of the other things I want to do too is contextualize this in history. And so we're not just looking at this expansion right now, but we're looking at prior presidential developments in immigration enforcement going back to the 19th century and actually even earlier. Mm-hmm. And two things that I sort of learned, I had maybe hints of this. I've been studying immigration and reporting on immigration for a long time. But one thing that surprised me in my research is that there has been a robust and constant history of resistance. Since the very first camps were built, people were pushing back against them and having these small wins. And there has been this continuity of organizing and just pushback that goes back 130 years at least. And that was one thing that was really inspiring to me. And I think is something that is important to hold on to not just fall into despair, but knowing that people have been resisting and helping in small ways to scale back the ultimate goal of these administrations over, a century plus.
To hear the full episode, become a patron at patreon.com/deathpanelpod.